we've been doing in class. I'm going to call it the 1920s Culture Clash PowerPoint. And like I promised, 16 minutes or under. So here are the topics I said we were going to cover. So far we've just covered the race riots. I reorganized them a little bit. So let's get going. Next topic, we're going to look at what we were talking about Friday, immigration. So there are the three waves. It kind of looks like it might be 2 or 4 or something, but if you look, here's wave number 1. We talked about that in class on Friday. Here's wave number 2, and here's wave number 3. So that's all stuff we did Friday. The second topic I want to talk about is the Red Scare of 1919. If you look at this cartoon for a moment, you might want to pause and look at it. We've got, of course, the Statue of Liberty welcoming immigrants in, and the phrase, "Come unto me, ye oppressed." And behind that is a kind of scary-looking figure, sketchy European anarchist, it says on his cloak. He's got a bomb with a fuse that's going, and the ever-present curved knife. And he's drawn to look like he is kind of stereotypically Eastern European and Jewish, and we'll get to that in a second. There have been 2 Red Scares in American history. The first one I'm talking about now, and the second one that you're more familiar with from the late 40s and early 50s. 2 things really cause the first Red Scare. The first is the Communist Revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And an entire country gets taken over by communists, and there is a great fear that communist revolutions are going to be spreading. I'll just take a minute here to kind of talk about why Americans have had such a huge fear of communism for decades. If we're built on freedom, and that's our deepest value, communism is built on government control. And so it is government control of the economy, and it's also government control over the individual. And so Americans have always feared communism as like an evil, more than, say, Europe has. When you combine the Bolshevik Revolution with the second wave of immigrants, which had already kind of peaked and ended, but had brought in a lot of Eastern Europeans, including Russians, and including many Jews who were kind of stereotyped as, in the prejudices of the day, as being very left-wing and likely to cause revolution. You get this fear that they were bringing revolution to America, kind of like the fear that many people kind of unreasonably have had in recent days, that Muslims are bringing jihadist revolution to America, or terrorism. There are a couple of things that spark the Red Scare more specifically than those underlying causes. One is, after the war, there are a large number of labor strikes, and they're often violent, as workers who had kind of put aside grievances about working conditions and wages during the war in a patriotic mood. They kind of put up with it, strike for better conditions. And many of the unions have become very radical, especially, just in as example, something called the IWW, known as the Wobblies, out in the far west of Seattle, working on the docks and in the factories of Seattle. And there's some really aggressive strikes. So there are anarchists in the United States as well, people who want no government, and they manage to mail some bombs to prominent officials, and most of the bombs do no damage. One bomb is mailed to the Attorney General's home, and the maid opens the package and her hands get blown off. But there's not a lot of deaths or damage from it, but they scare people, and as they could have caused a lot of damage. The effects is to create a short burst of hysteria against immigrants and against kind of labor union people who are on the radical side, and to kind of hype up fear of communism. And so there's this short fear that communism is kind of coming to America through the immigrants. It leads to the Palmer raids. The Attorney General was a man named A. Mitchell Palmer, and he does a lot of arrests with little proof of just people who are immigrants. Many immigrants are deported, and initially it's seen as very popular, and it's seen as an appropriate response to the threat. Eventually, they realized that he'd arrested a lot of people who were completely innocent, and he'd gone overboard, and it was seen as a violation of rights. As a side note, Palmer was kind of this aggressive law and order guy, and he was looking to run for the presidency in 1920, and he was hoping this would kind of catapult him into the front-runner status. And eventually, when there's a backlash against the arrests, he fades away. And just as a final side note, that's a picture of J. Edgar Hoover, a very young J. Edgar Hoover, who is part of the Justice Department and the Palmer raid team. He is going to not be tarnished by the Palmer raids, and is eventually going to start up the first federal agency to investigate criminals that the states can't handle. And that is eventually going to be renamed as the FBI. And he is going to be the head of the FBI through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s. He's one of the most powerful men in America in the 1900s. And we'll talk more about him when we talk about the 50s. There's a second reaction to the immigrant wave, which again, by the 1920s is over. So this is kind of a delayed reaction. The Congress passes two laws, the Immigration Act of 1921, and that's a Quota Act, and something called the National Origins Act of 1924. And both of them are trying to limit the influx of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who are seen as un-American and not ready to assimilate and just too different from real Americans. And it does it by limiting each country to a quota of what they can send in. And the quotas are based on a percentage of what the population was in 1890. So they try to set the quota year back far enough to so there weren't many Italians or many Russians or Polish people in America in 1890, and so that means the quotas from those countries are very small. And that's just another example of nativism. We've talked about that before. The fourth kind of example of the culture clash in the 1920s is the rise of the KKK. I want you to take a look at that picture for a moment and just kind of write down what you notice from it. You should notice a couple of kind of really stark things about it. The KKK surges in three different waves. The first wave is in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era, and it's confined to the South, and it's a vigilante group that kind of enforces the social and political order that we talked about in the South, where blacks are supposed to know their place, and if they get out of line, they can be threatened or intimidated or dealt with violently. The third wave, I'm going to skip the second wave for a second, is in the civil rights era, the 50s and 60s. And again, the KKK operates mostly in the South, and it is kind of an intimidating vigilante group. The second wave is the weird one. It is nationwide. It's not just confined to the South. It is more open and less secretive than it was in the 20s. And it is more almost like a political party. And it definitely has a lot of power in the Democratic Party. The 1924 election, everybody's talking about it a lot lately because it was a contested convention for the Democrats, and they couldn't choose between two candidates one who was a Catholic and represented kind of the immigrants of the Northeast. That was Al Smith. And another who was openly backed by the KKK. And they went to 103 ballots in the Democratic convention before they eventually chose neither candidate and went with another guy who lost in the actual election. So the differences of the KKK in the 20s are, like I said, it's nationwide. Number two, it is more open. And number three, it's kind of more political. And so people ran for office saying they were KKK members. It was less violent. And then the final thing you should note is it is when it is at its most popular. And so millions of people join the KKK in the 20s. But they don't join for very long. And I think what happened is there were a lot of people who were upset about the changes that were happening to America, like we talked about last week. And they wanted an America, like I mentioned, that was white and Christian and rural. And the KKK appealed to them, at least for a short time, as being able to bring America back that way. So, they didn't like the Catholics coming over. They didn't like the Jews coming over. They didn't like immigrants at all. They didn't like the changes where women were getting more freedom and power, and how America seemed to be more secular and less religious. And the KKK kind of offered an answer to all of that. And so I think that explains the surge in popularity. I think a lot of people left when they found that the KKK really wasn't about those things. So that's how I would explain the second surge of the KKK. The next culture clash item is the trial of the century, one of two in the 20s. That's Bartolomeo, or Nicola Sacco on the left, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti on the right. Sacco and Vanzetti. And this is a photograph of a poster actually from England. That's Trafalgar Square, saying "Save Sacco and Vanzetti." And that just is an example of how worldwide the demonstrations and argument was about should they be executed or not. So here are the facts of the trial. Sacco and Vanzetti were both immigrants from Italy, and they were both anarchists. But they, throughout their various trials, maintained that they were peaceful anarchists. They were accused and then arrested for the homicide in 1920 of a payroll guard outside Boston. He was guarding a payroll truck for a shoe factory. They were eventually convicted. The appeals went on for years, and the debate about them went on for years. They were eventually executed. The controversy was that the judge was clearly racist against them. The trial was clearly biased against them. And many of the witnesses and the testimony was kind of suspect. So it's not clear whether they were actually innocent or guilty, although probably in today's courtroom they probably wouldn't have been convicted because there wasn't enough evidence. The nation was divided as to their guilt or innocence. Many people were sympathetic. Others saw them as violent, un-American, and dangerous. Were they guilty? I don't know. I tend to lean to maybe not, but it's not clear. The trial is significant because it, again, showed the fact that it became such a big deal shows the debate of the time. And note that this is not a Supreme Court trial at all. It's just a murder trial, kind of like the O.J. Simpson trial. It's not significant because it changed anything. It's significant because of what it reveals or shows about the 20s. And it shows the culture clash between those who supported them and those who didn't. And that goes back to the kind of modernist versus traditionalist debate. And another trial, Tennessee versus John Scopes, generally called the Scopes trial or the monkey trial. Tennessee passed a law against teaching evolution. John Scopes purposely tested the law in a high school bio class. That's a photo of the defense attorney on the left and a witness for the prosecution, William Jennings Bryan, on the right. It's the other famous trial of the century in the 20s, and it's famous because of the famous participants and because of radio. There was national attention. Clarence Darrow is one of the most famous defense attorneys in American history. He defended Scopes. William Jennings Bryan is a presidential candidate and witness for the prosecution. It's a big deal because, again, like I said, it got national attention, and it was yet another example of the debate between the modern world, evolution, and a belief in kind of the Bible and literal fundamental Christianity. In the end, Scopes was fined, and it was just like $100 fine or something like that. But the trial had kind of an after effect week later that I will tell you about in class. And I'm at 15:51, so I'm stopping. See you in class.